shadows of history are often longer and darker than we care to imagine. In the late 1940s, as the world was trying to heal from the scars of World War II, a new kind of war was brewing in the silence, the Cold War. It wasn't just a war of borders or missiles, it was a war for the very soul and mind of humanity. Deep behind the Iron Curtain, in a facility so secret it appeared on no Soviet map, a group of researchers embarked on a journey into the ultimate unknown, the necessity of sleep. They believed sleep was a biological flaw, a wasted third of a human life that weakened the state. Their goal was ambitious and terrifying, to create a soldier who never blinked, never tired, and never lost focus. To achieve this, they needed subjects who were already forgotten by the world. They went to the gulags. They selected 5 political prisoners, men who had been labeled traitors, men whose families believed they were already dead. The deal was simple. Stay awake for 30 days, the lead researcher told them through the cold bars of their cell. Survive the month without a moment of rest, and your crimes will be erased. You will walk out
Please,
of
you have to let us
free
out.
It's not safe yet.
citizens of
Stay
the
back.
Soviet
We can't
Union.
stay here. It's getting worse.
For
Control
men
yourself.
rotting in the damp, freezing cells of the Siberian camps, this was more than a deal. It was a miracle. But they didn't know that the freedom being offered was a door to hell they couldn't possibly conceive. The chamber was a masterpiece of cold, scientific cruelty. It was a sealed environment, a glass-walled cage where every breath they took was monitored. There were books, enough dried food to last a month, running water, and a toilet. But there were no beds, no pillows, nothing that would even suggest the possibility of lying down. The air they breathed was mixed with a carefully calibrated concentration of Nikolai gas, an experimental stimulant designed to keep the human brain in a state of permanent, artificial wakefulness. For the first 3 days,
We must decide now.
But the risks are too great.
they spoke
no other
with
way.
energy
Agreed,
that
we move.
surprised the observers. They told stories of their childhoods in the countryside, their first loves, and the lives they hoped to reclaim. They joked about the researchers watching. 5 more days and we'll be halfway there, one said, laughing. The scientists took notes, their pens scratching against paper in the silent observation room. Everything was going according to plan. The gas was working, the subjects were alert, cooperative, and surprisingly healthy. But on the 5th day, the tone shifted. The laughter died. The stories stopped. The prisoners began to talk about their pasts again. But this time, the memories weren't gone. They were
The
haunted.
secret's in its great
They
bag.
spoke of the mistakes they made, the people they had betrayed, and the trauma of the war. They began to experience the first stages of sleep deprivation-induced psychosis. They stopped looking at each other. They stopped speaking to each other. Instead, they took turns standing before the one-way mirrors, whispering to their own reflections, or perhaps to the researchers they knew were hiding behind the glass. On the 6th day, the whispers turned to paranoia. They started accusing one another of being spies, of being the reason they were in this hell. Each man believed he was the only one truly awake,
Quiet, they'll hear
and
us.
that the
Let
others
go.
were
Not until
plotting
you
against him.
I promise.
They whispered into the microphones, trying to win the favor of the researchers by betraying their fellow captives. The social bond that makes us human was dissolving, replaced by a raw, primal urge to survive at any cost. Then came the 9th day. The silence was shattered by the sound that no human ear should ever hear. One of the subjects suddenly stood up and began to run. He ran from one end of the chamber to the other, his boots pounding against the cold floor. And then he started to scream. It wasn't a scream of pain or anger. It was a hollow, soul-tearing shriek. He screamed for 3 hours straight. The researchers watched in horror as his face turned purple, his eyes bulging. And then, suddenly, the sound changed. It became a wet, gargling noise. He had screamed so hard and for so long that he had literally torn his vocal cords to pieces. But the most chilling part wasn't the scream itself. It was the reaction of the other 4 subjects, or rather, the total lack of it. They didn't even look up. They continued their mad whispers into the microphones, as if the man tearing his throat apart next to them didn't exist. It was as if they had already moved beyond the realm of human empathy. They were becoming something else, something the gas had awakened. On the 11th day, the whispers stopped. A heavy, oppressive silence fell over the room. The researchers checked the microphones, fearing a mechanical failure. But the sensors showed that the subjects were still breathing. They were still alive. They were just silent. Then, one by one, the subjects began to tear the pages out of the books provided to them. They didn't read them. They didn't use them for warmth. Instead, they began to smear the pages with their own excrement and pressed them against the glass observation windows. One by one, the windows were blacked out. The scientists could no longer see what was happening inside. They were blind, left only with the sound of the subject's heavy, rhythmic breathing through the speakers. Days passed in darkness. No sound, no movement, just the oxygen consumption levels showing that all 5 were still consuming massive amounts of air, more than a normal human should.
Stop, get back!
Finally,
No, I won't
on
go
the
back.
15th
Last
day,
warning.
the lead researcher made a decision that would change everything. Cut the gas, he ordered. Fill the room with fresh air. We are going in. They used the intercom to
No,
announce
let me go.
their arrival.
Move it!
We are
Please stop.
opening the
Get
chamber
him
to
inside.
test the microphones. Step away from the door and lie flat on the floor, or you will be shot. Compliance will earn one of you immediate freedom. A long silence followed, and then
Let me go!
a
You can't
single
get in!
voice
You don't
whispered
understand! It's
from
too
the
dangerous!
darkness
I
of the
don't care!
chamber.
Get off me!
A voice that sounded less like a man and more like a predator. The words echoed through the intercom, freezing the blood of every scientist in the observation room. We no longer want to be freed. It was the 15th day, and the experiment had officially spiraled out of human control. The lead researcher, driven by a mixture of scientific obsession and sheer terror, gave the final order. The chamber was to be opened. At midnight, the gas was completely flushed out and replaced with fresh, sterile air. Immediately, something went wrong. The microphones picked up a frantic, desperate sound. The subjects were begging for the gas to be turned back on. They were crying out as if their very lives depended on the toxic stimulant. When the researchers refused, the screaming began again. Not from one, but from all of them. They were terrified of the fresh air. They were terrified of the possibility of sleep. Then, the heavy steel doors were unsealed. Armed soldiers, hardened by the horrors of the front lines, were sent in to retrieve the subjects. But as they stepped into the chamber, they were met with a sight that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Of the 5 original subjects, only 4 were technically alive, though the word alive felt like a lie. The 5th subject lay dead in the center of the room. His body had been torn apart, his flesh stripped from his bones and stuffed into the floor tray. But it wasn't the dead man that paralyzed the soldiers. It was the survivors. They were no longer human. They had ripped the skin from their own chests and abdomens with their bare hands. Their internal organs were visible, pulsing and working behind a thin veil of muscle and bone. They had consumed their own flesh. One subject had his ribs exposed, his lungs visible through the gaping hole in his chest. And yet, they were moving, they were standing, they were smiling. When the soldiers tried to move them, the subjects exploded into a frenzy of supernatural violence. One soldier had his throat torn out by the teeth of a subject. Another was severely dismembered. The subjects displayed a strength that defied biological limits, as if the lack of sleep had unlocked a primal adrenaline-fueled power. They weren't fighting to escape. They were fighting to stay in the darkness. They were screaming for the gas. "Turn it back on," they shrieked. "We must stay awake." The survivors were eventually restrained and taken to a medical facility. The scenes that followed were even more bizarre. The first subject to be operated on fought so hard against the restraints that he snapped his own bones and tore his muscles. When the doctors tried to administer a sedative, his heart rate spiked to over 200 beats per minute. He took enough morphine to kill 3 men, and yet he didn't close his eyes. He just stared at the surgeon, his eyes wide and bloodshot, hissing like a wounded animal. The second subject, the one who had destroyed his vocal cords on the 9th day, could only communicate by shaking his head. When the surgeon began to cut into him without anesthesia to repair his organs, the subject didn't flinch. Instead, he began to laugh, a wet, silent laugh that shook his entire mangled body.
Team, the
When the
anomaly's ahead. Stay
surgery
sharp.
was
Follow my
over,
lead. Copy.
he
Moving out.
gestured for a
Keep formation.
pen
Watch for
and
hostiles.
paper. The nurse, trembling, handed them to him. He wrote 3 simple words: "Keep cutting, more." The researchers began to realize that these men had reached a state of existence where pain was no longer a deterrent, but a stimulant.
They were trapped in a permanent state of fight or flight, their brains rewired by the gas and the sheer trauma of 15 days of wakefulness. They were no longer political prisoners. They were something else entirely. A glimpse into the raw, unfiltered violence of the human subconscious. One by one, the subjects began to die as their bodies finally succumbed to the massive physical damage they had inflicted upon themselves. But the last survivor was the most
The mystery of missing
haunting of all.
explorers in Siberia
The
deepens
lead
what began as a routine
researcher,
expedition has
now
now become an
consumed
international
by
concern.
guilt and madness, drew his pistol. He pointed it at the last man on the table, the one who had been the most vocal. "What are you?" the researcher demanded, his voice trembling. "I must know. What have we created?" The subject smiled, a wild, terrifying grin that reached his ears. He whispered in a voice that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth. "Have you forgotten so easily? We are you. We are the madness that lurks within you all, begging to be free every moment in your deepest animal minds. We are what you hide from in your beds every night. We are what you sedate into silence and paralysis when you go to the place where we cannot tread." The researcher stared in silence for a long second. Then he aimed at the last man's heart and fired. The last subject's eyes began to close for the first time in over 15 days. His last breath was a faint, satisfied sigh. His final words were barely audible. "So nearly free." The facility was eventually scrubbed. The records were burned. The government officially denied that the experiment had ever taken place. But the legend lived on, whispered in the corridors of power and the dark corners of the internet. Because deep down, everyone knows the truth. The monster isn't the gas. The monster is what happens when the lights stay on for too long, and we are forced to look at what we really